Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello. Nice to see you. Sorry for being a couple minutes late. Life has been a bit hectic, but I hope yours is calmer and smoother. Nice to see you. So go ahead, because I need a minute just to kind of pull some things up and get um, kind of set here. But go ahead and pull up Brommuller and Sartori, the reading from 2 classes ago. I do want to discuss that a little bit so you can, maybe take the next minute or two to reflect on your notes about the promise and perils of statistics as we try to learn more about international behavior in a quantitative way. And really, I just want to kind of review what were your key takeaways from that reading about the advantages and disadvantages of doing statistical or quantitative research to learn more about international behavior. So if you want to try to apply that to your own work, whether it's current work or the kind of work that you want to do in the future, or you just want to think about it in kind of more general terms like Brommuller and Sartori did, I'd just be interested in a brief discussion there led by you all about some of the key takeaways and observations. After that, I'm just kind of more or less following what I put in the meat and potatoes log in terms of the plan for today. I do want to really discuss between Hankey and Moore and Shellman. I really want to discuss the Moore and Shellman reading, and prioritize that one. The one from Marina Hankey, as you know, was just introducing a data set. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I think, my main purpose of giving you that reading was to give you a sense of, how data is created, where it comes from, the fact that, the heavens don't just open up and we have a data set. But ultimately, right, it's human labor that goes into creating data that we ultimately use to learn more about the world. And I think Hankey's data set on UN peacekeeping fatalities and the way she describes that data set just kind of helps to understand that process and also the kind of output or the outcome from it, which is a new data set that has a variety of different indicators and measures specific to a topic that researchers can then use to learn more about, let's say, the safety and security of UN personnel when they carry out peacekeeping missions and what explains variation in that level of safety and security. So anyway, I don't know that we need to discuss that one heavily, but if there are observations you want to make about that, that's great. Really, we'll focus a fair amount of time on Moore and Shellman reverse engineering their research design. And so we'll come to that. Otherwise, I also just want to review that. I mean, we'll kind of move from that readings-based discussion onto a hands-on kind of workshop where we will review anything that you want to review from the starting with Stata tutorial #1. If you don't have anything you want to review from that, that's okay. And we'll move right on to working through starting with Stata tutorial #2 together. But I'm definitely happy to give as much time as necessary in the starting with Stata tutorial #1 content that you were to work through on your own before we do that. Before we move on to #2 and work on that one together. And then if there's time at the end, I didn't have time for this last night with my other section, but maybe we will. Different classes go different ways. But we could then start working on practice problems 1 in preparation for the problem set. Okay, so the first problem set, just by way of a couple of administrative things, the first problem set that's due next week on Friday, I'm going to release to you after class tonight. Okay, but the practice problems are, of course, there for you to do some practice where the stakes are low, right, compared to an assignment. And so if you want to work through some of those practice problems, you can do that, right, in a place where it's not necessarily something you submit for a grade, #1. Number two, you're more than welcome to do practice problems together with others, and you're not allowed to do that for a problem set assignment. And number three, I give you my state of code for the practice problems, right? So you kind of have maybe not the written out interpretation or the written out answers, but you have the state of code that gets you the right answers for my practice problems. Okay, so we may have time to do that in class, but even if we don't, you have practice problems that you can work on your own or with other people with my state of code that helps you through it, and in a kind of low stakes environment that you might want to do alongside or before jumping into your problem set. Okay. Um, so that's really the kind of plan for today as I see it. But before we jump into class, or those particular items, I just want to start out, since we're only in our second face-to-face class meetup, to see if there are any questions administrative wise or logistics wise, that you want to raise. We spent a lot of time last class going over the syllabus, the website, the course administration, how it ultimately functions. And then we transitioned into substantive kind of content. And I just want to give a few minutes to circle back to some of that administrative stuff, since there was a lot there, to see if there are just any questions or issues that you want to raise. Chanel?
So the only question I have right now is the meat and potatoes log that's on the website. Is that going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, are you going to update it as we go throughout the weeks? Because I think it's only up until like a certain.
Correct. That's right. And so that goes up through class 6, and I would expect before next week starts, I'll go ahead and add 2 more. And the reason I do that is just because I like the flexibility of kind of seeing where we are. And instead of me constantly having to say, toss out your old syllabus or the one we started with because I made some little tweaks or amendments, I can constantly kind of update that. And sometimes, the updates may even just be, not a wholesale, I'm adding a whole class block, but I might, as I'm working through the content with you, I mean, I've done all of this before, right? Of course, many times, but as I'm kind of keeping pace with the class, there may be certain kind of like notes or things that come to mind that I want to share with you in terms of what to focus on in a reading, or something like that, that normally I put in blue text, right? Little notes that might just help guide you through something. Or I'll tell you what is the purpose or what should you pay special attention to in a video lecture or something like that. And so I might add some of those things as we go along as well. I will never update something for work you're supposed to do like the next day. So you can be confident that what you're supposed to do for class 4, which is the asynchronous class for, let's say, later this week or whenever you tend to do your asynchronous work, that one is already set and done, and I'm not going to go, messing with that because everybody's going to be ready after tonight's class to move on to it. Does that answer it? Great. Other questions? Connor?
I just opened up handout number 5 a little bit ago.
Yes, handout number 5. We'll come to that.
Okay, it seems to be in Greek.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is.
All right. Just was making sure I wasn't crazy.
You're right. So let's come to that. Let's do it now, because I waited on that as something that I left class with or exited last night, but I didn't leave sufficient time to work through it. So I ended up taking the class last night, past 8 o'clock. And I don't want to do that this time. And so let's go ahead and just talk about handout 5 now. So if you go to handout 5 on the class website, you see that I give you a problem set example, and I'll share my screen so that way you don't have to navigate there if you don't want. Let me pull it here. And so we can go to handout 5 problem set example. And this is, I just wanted I wanted to make a few observations about the problem set and what a problem set should look like, given that many of you haven't maybe submitted a problem set before or done this kind of work. And so I just wanted to make some observations to make sure that we start out on the right, foot in terms of what the expectations might be. So this is not the problem set that you're going to get. All of the red stuff is the answers. Okay. And the stuff in black, and is generally in English, is going to be, right, the instructions. And so this gives you a sense of the kind of thing I will be asking you for in problem set 1, but a completely different set of questions and using a completely different data set than the one that this assignment uses. So actually, really quickly, I'm just going to pick on you, Connor, since you brought this up. Can you be our timekeeper and just jot down some notes along the way? So it's like, we're at minute, like, let's say 12 right now, since we started at 5:32. And just say, like, this is where we opened the problem set example. And then when we move to the Bramall and Sartori reading, you can kind of take note of that. Awesome, thanks. So what you're looking at here in question number 1 is where I give you some data and I ask you to do some arithmetic. And this is kind of a reinforcement of what you did in the skills assessment. Not all of it, but I'm using real international relations data now, so that way you can kind of demonstrate your understanding of calculating let's say percentage shares, or different basic questions. And so those will just be calculations based on some data I give you in a table. After that, I will give you a word problem like this, right? And you're supposed to kind of graph the relationship between two variables and talk about the effect of one on another, right? Based on the question above. And the first observation I want to make here is all of these first questions, right, ask you for a numerical answer. But notice that my answers, even though you can't read them, are complete sentences. And that's because your problem set should be written up as a report, right? So think about it as a professional report. Even if the answer is just a single number, right, you answer it as a sentence. Or if you obtain results, right, and I say discuss your results, right, you actually are thoughtful about how you discuss those results. You use proper grammar and syntax and spelling and everything else to provide a clear and coherent response based on the the actual answer you get. So just keep in mind, I think, the general ethos of professional report, and if you think about it in that way, then you'll be pretty good. Sometimes the answers require a couple of sentences, like here. Sometimes they require a paragraph, right? Like you see down here, where I'm really asking you to kind of engage in a discussion, okay? If I ask you to provide a table, right, I want you to make a nice looking, well-formatted table. Right? Notice here I say in the instructions, create a cleanly formatted table. To my mind, a cleanly formatted table should indicate what's in your columns, right? Or your rows. You should have, clear numerical values. So that way we can read what it is that you're presenting. I would prefer that. I will show you how to make nice tables directly from Stata later. For now, I don't ask you for tables that are so complex or have so much information that you can't quickly create one in Microsoft Word or Pages or whatever you use to create your document. So as you can see here, this table doesn't really come out of Stata, right? You all have practiced now creating like a frequency table in Stata. This is not a screenshot of that. This is a table that I took the time to create. And so I would expect you to do that. If you don't know how to make a table in Microsoft Word, Google is your friend, right? I mean, there has to be some kind of entrepreneurial spirit if you don't know how to do something that you need to do. Now, of course, if it's a Stata related thing, or frankly, even if it is, how do I make a table in Microsoft Word or Pages, you can also take that to the forum if you like. The forum is an open space for you to ask and answer anything or discuss anything at all, no matter how simple or complex it is. So anyway, moving along, you can see here, some of these answers require a sentence and some of them require a paragraph. We'll talk a little bit about graphing before it's time for you to submit your problem set. But I also kind of expect you to output good looking graphs from Stata. And I'll talk to you about how when you do create like a scatter plot or a box plot or some other type of graphical representation of data within Stata, I will tell you later how we export that or save that file and then insert it into a Microsoft Word or Pages document. Okay. But ultimately, we want those to look nice and professional as well, as you see here. Here's a scatter plot, same kind of thing, paragraph answers. There's a histogram, which you've already learned how to do, and starting with Stata tutorial number 1. Again, a table, right? So sometimes the answer is just a table or a graph. Other times it requires discussion, but I generally indicate to you, what it is you should be providing as an answer. Provide a frequency table. Now at the end, and this is just a quick point that, I can clarify if there are questions around this, but I introduced to you the difference between a data file, like a .dta file that contains the data set, and a do file that contains your code, your program code. Correct? Wasn't that in the starting with Stata tutorial number 1? And we can go over that again if you'd like. I'm happy, to meet that demand if there is. But here's the point. Notice up here in the report, I do not include any Stata programming code, no syntax. I know you can't read this stuff because it's in a different language. But I don't anywhere in here, you don't see anything that looks like Stata code. And that's because there's no reason to put that up in if you keep in mind, a professional report, right? That's what happens behind the scenes. A professional report puts forward, your responses, your answers, your interpretations. It doesn't include the kind of stuff that happens in the software program. That is something I want you to include as an appendix at the end. And so what you're going to do is essentially save your do file, open it up on your computer as like a text file, and then copy and paste it into your Microsoft Word or Pages or Google Docs, whatever it is, document as an appendix in your report. And so we'll talk more about how to organize your do file that has all of your program code in it. But ultimately, I want to be able to see all of your code at the end. Why? Because even if you get an incorrect answer, right? Number one, what it is that you did in Stata is worth some kind of partial credit, right? Because you obviously did some work to try to get the right answer, but you came up short at the end. So that's number one, just in terms of like practical, class grading stuff. Number two is it gives me some insight into where you're going wrong, and I can address that with you individually. Or if I see some systematic things where lots and lots of people are making the same kind of mistake, then I can address it collectively as a class because it's something then we need to remedy. And so it's really important that I can see your code. Okay. Any questions about this? All right. Any other questions in general, administrative, logistical? How are we doing getting up and running in Stata? I've spent a fair amount of time in the forum trying to help people navigate through some of the hurdles associated with that. I think we've been successful in all but one case, which is perplexing, but I'm working with that person to get that figured out ASAP. Jeremy?
Kind of two questions. So when we run Stata, I saw in the discussion board, it's downloaded on our computer, but we're still using the web browser to access it, correct?
No, no. And let me kind of clarify what's going on, which is easier to do right when we're face to face here in person. So thank you for the question. Let me share my screen one more time. I can do it over here still. So, well, let me share you my desktop first. So I'm kind of working across screens and sometimes confusing. Okay, so let me move you. All right. So notice down here, I have this VMware Horizon client. Okay, and that's the one that you should have installed on your computer. So when I double click that, right, it's going to open up this window here. Now, some of you may have done this, some of you not. This is not how your instructions work, right? The instructions from handout 2. But these, virtual apps, you can add a server and you can add the server vapps.american.edu and connect to it. And that will open up, it's doing it for me in a different screen. So let me bring this over here. And now you're on top of it. That will open up this website. And this is the website that is just the way that you access your apps, right? Your AU apps. So you can sign in here with your password and I use my phone as my camera. So give me a second. I'm going to see if I can get my Duo code here. This is the most annoying part for me always of the setup process. And if it just disconnected me, that's okay. I'll come back in a minute. But I'm just going to put in my Duo code now and then sign in. Okay, and then I'm looking at Stata as I'd like to. I'll come back to you now. Okay. Now you're looking at my wall. Let me turn you around. Okay, we're back. So now you're still looking at my screen, hopefully. And right, we see Stata here, and you have a couple of options. And the only option that I know works for what we're trying to do here is if we launch this from the client, not in a browser. If you launch it in a browser, right, it's going to open up as a new web browser, which I'll just do, for fun. And you'll see that, after a minute, Stata will open up within the browser. And frankly, I just don't know how to make Stata work nicely with the files on my computer when I'm running this from a browser. And since I always, recommend that people use the client instead, I've just never gone about trying to figure this out. Let's see if it has. See, the problem here is it doesn't have access to my actual computer. All of these files here on the left, these are files on a remote computer somewhere else that's running Stata. And so therefore it can't communicate directly with my computer. And there may be ways within the browser settings over here to deal with that. But frankly, it's not worth our time to, maybe it's in settings here. There's probably some way. Oh, it's through this file transfer panel. And this is how you can upload and download files. So this is, I guess, worthwhile to learn real quick together. I've never tried to do this before, right? But where you can choose files to go ahead and upload. So maybe, maybe we can go and find our class and, go into handouts and find a data set, right? And open it up, right? And so we could open up a data set because we've now added this file. So I assume now that I've uploaded that file into the web browser version of Stata, I would be able to somehow find it, and open it. The problem is, again, I don't know where that file goes once it's here. I don't know if it's on, I just don't know. So anyway, you're more than welcome to further navigate how you do that in the web browser. But the uploading and downloading of files seems very complex to me. The alternative, and the one that I would advocate you do, is to open in the client, right? Launch from client. And once you do this, generally speaking, all of these little icons in the bottom left will change to Horizon because they will by default open in the client going forward. So if you do launch from client, you get that little rocket ship, it says connecting, and then it's going to open it up within the VMware client. Now, what you need to know about that is it's still running from a remote computer over the internet somewhere else, but it makes it feel like it's actually running on your own computer, right? And so one of the things that I was kind of identifying for people in the discussion forum is that when you want to go and access your files now, right? This looks like just the Stata program on my computer, when in fact it's actually running remotely. You go to open, right? And again, this is not my computer here. This is the remote computer that doesn't contain any of my files that are on my computer. To access those, we can come down and find this Z drive. And I happen to have plugged in a portable hard drive and also another disk drive, so it's reading those as well. But the one that's like the core hard drive where you probably keep most of your files would be your Z drive. That's the main one. And it usually will have some, indication of your computer's name. So like my computer's default name is just AMSPA, right? So once I click in here, now I'm looking at the files on my computer, right? And so here I can go into, my OneDrive where I keep everything, my teaching, right? So now I'm looking at my files. So you always want to go down to the Z drive, and that's where you're going to find your files. And so what I would recommend everybody do, of course, is put somewhere on your computer your SIS600 folder. And any of the files that you download from the class website or any of the data files we use or anything else, right? You just put in a file called SIS600 or whatever you want to call it. And then you can go ahead and access those files in there. Mine happens to already exist in my quantitative methods folder and my SIS600. And then I can go into, right, like meat and potatoes and access the starting with Stata tutorials. And now I can open up the state year data set within Stata. And now we have the file open. If I want to open the do file, I'll come up here to the new do file editor. Right, so you see that at the top. So the do file, it's like the notebook paper with the pencil on top. If I click that, then I can click open. And again, navigate to the Z drive and to wherever my SIS600 folder is. And once I'm there, right, I'll go back into the meat and potatoes. I'll go to the starting with Stata, and now I want to open the do file. And so here's the do file that walks through the entire starting with Stata tutorial. Okay. And we can talk more about do files again later if people want a little bit of clarification about how these work and how they communicate with Stata. But essentially this is the, this is the code that I'm working through in that tutorial handout and also the tutorial video, right? I'm essentially just going line by line. Okay, so Jeremy, does that answer your question in terms of how you should ideally be running Stata?
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to go to like I guess OIT to work out like things that I'm not sure I already did or did do. But yes, that answered my question.
Okay, well, if you would like, so OIT is great, but I also want you to feel like you're up and running imminently. And so if you'd like, I always, plan to stick around after class for any general questions. So I'm happy to do that this evening. And you can also send me an email to just see if I'm available for, a Thursday or Friday kind of appointment, or
Okay.
Monday or Tuesday as well. Generally, I would prefer it during the week as opposed to the weekend. But go ahead and hit me up now if you'd like, especially for just getting up and running. Later
Okay.
down the line, if you have some other kind of technical questions, go to OIT. But for now, I want to make sure that everybody's at least able to access data and open a data set today, or tomorrow at the latest. So just stick around later, or if tomorrow's better, send me an email and we'll set something up. And that, I'm saying that to everybody. Connor?
Okay.
Just when I was going through the tutorial, so then if I were to create that new directory path with that cd command, that would also have to relate to that temporary Z file, right? Like, because like I was having the issue where I was trying to do that with my C drive and it was telling me that it was an invalid syntax.
Yeah, absolutely. And so
Okay.
I should not have just closed, I should not have just closed VMware and my Stata of VM, because I'll always run Stata just from my computer
Right.
because I have a license, right? But maybe and it will just run a little bit faster for me during class while I'm trying to kind of teach. So it's better that I'm running it there instead of through VMware. But what we can do is maybe a little experiment over the break. I can take a few minutes and just remind myself, because I know more or less what it looks like, but what that path looks like when you specify it using the Z drive.
Right, because
Uh,
it's like it's so much easier, I'm assuming for you, because like if you're in your file explorer, you can just click at the top and it'll give you the path, right?
That's
Like,
right. That's right.
you can't find that temporary.
Correct. One thing that you can do is simply, and again, we can do this later if this confuses people more than it clarifies, but I'll just say it now while we're on the topic. You can generally go and, like, we saw the stateyear.dta file, right, through the Z drive. You can generally right click and go to properties, and it'll give you the full file path there, even from within the remote version of Stata, the remote app. So see if that works. If not, I can again, specify what that file path structure looks like when you're doing it remotely through that Z drive, because I do have that written down. Adrian.
Yes. So I know you mentioned last week that we could, and I think the license was like for 6 months is like $50 or something. Is that going to make it inordinately easier to do all this than with the client?
It will make things easier.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you will simply do something like this, right? Where, you may have an icon on your desktop, or you can just type in Stata and click the button for Stata, and, it opens. So it is easier for sure than having to go through VMware and the apps and sign in with Duo and all of that kind of thing. And then when you open your documents, right, they're already just in your normal file directory that you're used to, and you don't have to find the Z drive and that kind of thing. A couple of the other easier things when you're running Stata, natively on your computer is the ability to copy and paste directly, where you cannot copy and paste directly from the AU apps. So that's something that, again, I wouldn't say it's easier. It's more efficient.
Yeah.
And so it's up to everybody's own judgment and budget and, kind of resolve dealing with kind of computer and technical issues about whether it makes sense to you based on that cost benefit analysis.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, any final questions, comments before we move on to Brummeler and Sartori? All right, very good. So let's go ahead and open up Brummeler and Sartori, either the reading or just your notes. And I just want to get, let's say, a few candid reactions. Given the time, I don't want to spend, a lot of time here. I think the reading, again, was trying to identify what good the statistical approach to understanding international affairs does. What good does it do? But also, what are some of the pitfalls we need to be aware of and maybe be humbled by as we pursue this approach to conducting research and learning more about the world, right? Or whatever interests us about it. So what are some of the observations you had about those advantages and pitfalls, or what were they? Alvina.
Yeah, I guess I think the first advantage you talked about is that when we have a lot of a tremendous number of cases, it's very easy to aggregate the data. So even if you're studying a single case study per se, it's really easy to aggregate the data and kind of look for common patterns in all of those cases.
Great. Can you say a little bit more about where you ended, right? So what is the utility of aggregating a large number of cases or bringing together, right, a lot of data? You ended by saying something about kind of trends or patterns. Can you say a little bit more about that advantage?
So, if you're a researcher, you want to look at what were the studies that previous researchers have done, and what behaviors were previously found in international affairs. That relates to your case. So, that's helpful when it's easy to aggregate information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So, I think maybe some of you saw in the discussion forum, I posted the video clip from Ozark that I mentioned during our first class. I went and screen captured it, and Netflix fortunately allowed me to do that. But yeah, I think in general, and we'll learn much more about this in let's say a fuller bodied way as we go forward. But I think the basic notion is that it's very hard to identify generalizable trends or patterns or later relationships between variables if we only have one observation or 5 observations or 10 observations of something, right? But if we have a much larger sample, then we can start to identify those trends and patterns or general relationships between things, like whether two things are correlated with each other. Because in isolation, one observation or a handful of observations may go against a general trend. But we might not know about that general trend if we can only study one or a handful of those cases or of those observations. And so that's like, Marty says when he's talking about laundering money in the casino and wanting to do so without being popped by the FBI is, before I go about doing that, I want to be able to collect systematic data through surveillance and floor movements and cash flow at different tables and other things to see if I can identify any general trends or patterns of people cheating, right? Or of essentially excess kind of scrutiny, from officials. And he says, I can't do that if I look at one bet, right? Or if I take data for one day of our traffic flow or our cash flow. But if I do that, sufficiently over time with a lot of observations, then I can start to identify not only trends and patterns, but also outliers, right? Deviant cases, observations that go against the trend and therefore might be kind of red flags. And so this is kind of what we're trying to do, but in the context of observations that aren't traffic flow on a casino floor, right? Or cash flow or something like that, or bets made. But in terms of international affairs phenomenon that we're interested in, like, peace agreements or militarized interstate disputes or bilateral investment treaties or commitments to environmental sustainability action, or name your point of interest. Which, by the way, it was really, really nice. I haven't responded, but it was really, really nice, as a quick side note, to read through all of your introductions and all of your interests. It's really cool. We have a really phenomenal group across this section and the other one, and you all come in with so many kind of just amazing interests and also backgrounds and experiences or current things that you're doing. And so I'm just, it's my pleasure to get to know you. So thanks for sharing. Back to Bromweiler and Sartori, what other observations did you make from the reading? Chanel.
Observation and a question. So with the potential pitfalls, what I wanted to, I guess, get clarification on was, they were saying that, despite the power of the statistical methods, statistical evidence sometimes is far from persuasive. So are they kind of stating that even though they're using statistical methods to explain X, Y, and Z, that some people may not understand what they're saying because of the statistical method used, or because of the, what am I trying to say? Because of the answers that they got. Like,
So tell me where you just read that from, and we can all go there and kind of see the.
I think it's like the 4th page. It's like it's right under potential pitfalls. For me, it's page 132.
I see. Okay. Yep.
Because I just want to make sure, because from what I gathered, just from my understanding with just kind of looking at different researches, because they say something about models of human behavior and that as a result. So are they saying all of the evidence that they've gathered, even though they have the evidence, they have the statistical knowledge to back it up, individuals may still believe that it's not all that correct, or the methods that they're using is not the best, or certain ways that they've reached this type of evidence is not persuasive enough to explain what's happening because this is just natural behavior. That's where I kind of got lost.
Sure. So I think when they transition into pitfalls, and then I'm happy to hear other people's interpretation, before they get into the specific errors, right? Errors of specification, errors of inference, but where they're making a more general claim, my reading of that says that some folks may either come to try to, let's say, consume quantitative research, or other folks may try to produce quantitative research without fully grasping or appreciating some of the underlying complexity involved, and therefore may not be properly wielding the tools of quantitative methods or statistics. In other words, making mistakes that lead to problems of validity, right? Validity of results. Or that when people consume quantitative research or quantitative studies, everything might appear so mathemagical, right? That it's kind of it's kind of a smoke and mirrors, and they're either willing to just kind of accept it or reject it based on whether it confirms their biases, right, and their priors, or whether they like or don't like the conclusion, or whether they just buy it because it seems so complex that it must be right. And so I think what they're trying to do there is just introduce the notion that that quantitative methods is based on, or is not based on, but quantitative methods does work out of some underlying assumptions that we need to make ourselves familiar with. And frankly, that's one of the main purposes of this class, is to understand, at a base level, what quantitative and statistical hypothesis testing is and what's going on a little bit under the hood, and how to interpret the results, and also be kind of skeptical scrutinizers of the results, but not in some knee-jerk flippant way where it's just like, well, I don't get it and I don't like the answer, and so I'm going to reject it, right? But to actually say, well, there are some issues with the research design that impact the reliability and validity of the results that were obtained from this statistical model, right? And that's the kind of understanding I want you to end the semester with, right? But we're going to practice throughout the semester. And that is, what are some of the threats to validity and reliability that we should be aware of? And that's where they go into errors of specification and errors of inference as being two kind of general types of those. And we'll talk about those throughout the class. Jasmine.
So I guess I have a question, like a clarification question. So I noticed in the reading, it's in the same section of pitfalls. I interpreted to reduce errors of specification. I guess you should have a well-developed theory, or your before you go into gathering data and testing your hypothesis, you should have a well-developed theory. By well-developed, do they mean like you have developed your theory well, or do they mean a theory that has a lot of, I don't know, like backing in the political sphere, or has, I don't know, there's been a lot of already existing research towards it? Is that personal, or is it like general?
Yeah, so let me say a couple words about theories, and then maybe we can come back to this in our meeting next week when we start thinking about how cause and effect are represented by variables that we test with hypotheses. But I think it's a great question, and it's very valid for right now. But I don't want to spend too much time discussing it quite yet, because I just know how I can get going, and I want to prioritize a few other things as well. But let's just say that when we think about research in a scientific way, we don't want to just be crunching numbers. We don't want to be mindless kind of data miners. Does that make sense, right? Like we get all this data in a data set, and we might have some basic understanding on how to run a t-test, or how to do crosstabs, or how to do a linear regression. But that doesn't mean that we should feel like we can just take any two variables and throw them together to see if there's a correlation, and then run for the hills if there is to say, look what I found. Because we should never actually go about running any of our quantitative analyses until we have thought through first what the underlying theory is to support there being a relationship between a cause and an effect, or this variable and that variable. An example I used with the class last night when we talked about this issue is, a basic fact that, has been demonstrated time and time and time again throughout contemporary history, that people with larger shoe sizes have better reading proficiency. Right? That's a correlation between two variables. The bigger your shoe size, the better reader you are. Empirical fact. What's the theory that supports that? Everybody knows your brain is in your feet, right? And so the bigger your feet, the bigger your brain, and therefore you read better. No, right? It's a spurious correlation. Right? And this is one of the errors that that Bramall and Sartori discuss, and it's also somebody raised it in the discussion forum and linked to an interesting website that I also use. You'll see it come up later in the semester about spurious correlations. In other words, correlations between two variables that either are just correlated by chance, just by happenstance, but have no underlying theory that supports them, or theories that are explained, correlations that are explained by some third variable that we didn't account for. What is the third variable right? This other variable we didn't account for when we thought about the correlation between shoe size and reading proficiency. There's some third variable, some other one besides those two that explains that correlation. Shannon?
Would it be like age?
Age. Age is simultaneously correlated with shoe size, right? And with reading proficiency. The older you are, right, the bigger your feet. And the older you are, generally, the better you read. Now, there may certainly be exceptions to that. But remember that we are trying to leverage, as Alvina mentioned before, the law of large numbers, right? Through a large number of observations, identifying generalizable patterns and relationships, right? Generalizable in the sense that they appear within a sample, but we can then infer that those relationships hold even outside of our sample, right? That we survey 1,000 people about, Joe Biden's success rate, or what do they call it? Not satisfaction.
Approval rating?
Thank you. The approval rating. I was out in the sun a lot today. Thank you. Joe Biden's approval rating, right? They sample 1,000 people, right? 1,000 people is a very minuscule number compared to the 330 million Americans, or whatever, 200 and something million adults. But nonetheless, we use that sample of 1,000 people to generalize about his approval rating in the broader population. And generally speaking, you see that if you look at, when you see these polls, they'll say the margin of error is plus or minus like 3.1%. Sometimes it's more than that, sometimes it's less. But generally, a margin of error of 3.1% is the margin of error you get when you've surveyed 1,000 people, or when the number of observations you have equals 1,000. And we'll talk later about how you actually calculate a margin of error. But what we know, right, mathematically, is that as our n increases, meaning as the number of observations we have goes up, the error or the noise around our correlation or around our pattern or trend that we've identified goes down. We have a much greater confidence and certainty in our results when the number of observations is larger. Leo.
So touching on that subject, would you say, for example, like when they say like I think it's like the primaries, for example, that they say like, oh, if a candidate wins Iowa, is pretty much like a set for the let's say for the nomination or for a certain candidate, even though Iowa is not the exact capture of the rest of the United States. Would you say that's like a spurious correlation of like?
I wouldn't say it's a spurious correlation. What you have there is essentially sample bias and people projecting, often incorrectly, who will win based on one state's, primary, or what do they call it there? It's not a primary, but I don't do American politics. But it's something else. And so there, right, I mean, and oftentimes the person who wins Iowa actually doesn't go on to win the nomination. And so, there are problems with that. But, that's people forecasting or making a projection that isn't well grounded in data. I mean, that would be an error of specification if you went about trying to say that because Pete Buttigieg or whoever it was who won Iowa, that they're going to go on and win the nomination. Why? Because Iowa is not representative of the broader population. And so you can't generalize or infer what the rest of the country is going to do in the, for the Democratic primaries based on what Iowa did, right? And so that's not really about a spurious correlation. It's more about, a different kind of error that we call sample bias. you know, if you were to project out from a sample that isn't representative of the broader population. I have a video that I want you to watch another time. I don't know how I can make sure you can all access it. It's available through PBS. I don't know if I can share it somehow, or if we'll just have to dedicate a little bit of class time to it, which is what I did in the spring semester. But it also will kind of help apply this stuff, especially what you're going to learn for next class on class number 4 on hypothesis testing and inferences. It'll help apply it to, you know, recent elections and some American politics, but also broader kind of theoretical things that you've been reading about in Kelstedt and Witten, for example, that I think will really be tangibly clarifying. And so stay tuned for that. I'll make sure I can share it with you in some way. So I really am trying to be good about time management. There's a couple of other things I wanted to talk about with Brammuller and Sartori, including the point that they're trying to make with those graphs on the bottom of 136 and the top of 137, those scatter plots, as well as the numerical data they provide in the table on the bottom of 136. But I think what I'm going to do is just post in the forum a kind of explanation with those pictures. So that way I can just very succinctly tell you what I'll otherwise take 10 minutes to tell you. Okay, and then we can just carry on with a discussion there. If you have some responses or further questions, we'll put that in the forum as a kind of asynchronous communication. But generally speaking, what you might have observed, so I'll just get to the bottom line up front and I'll save the rest of the explanation for later. What you might have observed and what Brammuller and Sartori were saying is that, let's just show you very quickly. Are you looking at the reading now? I'm sure that's what I'm sharing. Okay, thanks. So what we're seeing here is that this data up here, which you don't probably know too much about what this is saying at this point, but that's okay. The overall takeaway is that this data up here in this table applies to all 4 of these different data sets below. So you see the top left, the top right, the bottom left, and the bottom right. These are 4 completely different data sets. Right? You could think about it as 4 different samples of data, right? And they obviously look very different from each other, right? You have kind of this curvature inverted U in the top right. You have in the bottom right this kind of straight up and down vertical line with one little data point way out to the right. You have in the bottom left this kind of very straight line with one kind of higher value here. Can you see my mouse? Okay. And then in the top left, right, you have just kind of a smattering of data points that have a general upward trend, but are not very clearly consolidated into like a line. You know, there's a fair amount of noise or uncertainty there around the line itself. And the interesting point, and there are a few observations from this, but I'll just tell you the one and then write up the rest later, is that all 4 of those result in the same numerical results in this table above. They have the same coefficient, the same standard error, the same t statistic and p-value, the same 95% confidence interval. They all start at the same point as the constant. They all have, 11 observations with the same r squared, which we'll learn more about later. And so one of the takeaways here, amongst the others, is that different data can produce the same result. And so we need to be very mindful that it's important that we graph our data, that we show some visual representations of it, and that we try to understand kind of what it looks like and not just take the final results for granted or on their face. Okay, and so that has to do with visualizing data, but also just kind of thinking about how different configurations of data and different different aggregations of data and how they come together might actually produce the exact same outcome, and so we want to pay attention to what our data is, what it looks like. We want to get to know it in this like kind of intimate way, and not just kind of take the final result as it is. And that has to do with kind of being aware of some of these potential errors and the underlying assumptions of quantitative analysis. Okay, so with that said, let's transition to the fear of persecution, forced migration with Moore and Shellman. And I really want to kind of keep myself, I'm saying this out loud because it applies to me. So Connor, we're at the hour and 2 minutes. I want to really kind of keep this as efficient as possible. And that means I need you willing to kind of weigh in when I ask the question with an answer. Might be right, might be wrong, but I want you to be ready with your notes to answer questions. So generally speaking, right, we're going to cover an empirical study every class, synchronous or asynchronous, and then we're going to definitely discuss them together. And we always want to ask and answer the same types of questions about every empirical study. Right? This is not a class about forced migration. It's about research design, right? And so we always want to focus on research design elements. And this also pays off, by the way, in your other coursework or your other professional work when you are doing stuff on substantive topics, to be able to scrutinize the research designs that give rise to the, to the conclusions in those studies, because you have to be able to scrutinize them, right? And critically scrutinize them. So the kinds of things we always want to ask are, what's the research question? What's the unit of analysis? What's the dependent variable and how is it conceptualized and measured? What's the independent variable or variables and how is it conceptualized and measured? That's pretty much all of it on the research design end. And then of course, we want to know what are the results. But for now, I don't even want to pay attention to the results. I just want to focus on those kind of inputs into the study. Research question, unit of analysis, dependent variable, right, which is what is the outcome that varies that the authors are trying to explain, and how is it conceptualized, meaning defined in theoretical terms, and then how is it measured? In other words, how is it operationalized into empirical observations that can be measured? And then the same for the independent variable as well, the cause. Okay, so that's what I want to work through now. So go ahead and prep yourself to have an answer. What's the research question that Moore and Shellman are asking? Connor?
What factors explain variation in forced migration over time and countries?
Okay, and so I like how you started with what explains, because that's essentially what they're doing. They're asking a why or what explains question. And remember from our last class meeting, that's how we want our research questions posed from the beginning. Identify variation in an outcome. That's your dependent variable. Ask why it varies, right? And so they identify forced migration as an outcome that varies. It varies over time, and it also varies across countries. Why is that? What explains it? And they say what factors, which is the same as saying what explains the variation in forced migration across countries and over time. If we wanted to make it a why question, it might be something like, why do some countries and years experience or witness greater amounts of forced migration than others? Okay, very good. So that automatically means we know the dependent variable is forced migration. So how do they conceptualize, which again means define theoretically, how do they conceptualize forced migration. What is a forced migrant, or what is forced migration? So this is going to be hard because I have an Anastasia, and you're going to have to tell me the pronunciation for your name.
Anastasia.
Anastasia. Okay. So you're Anastasia and the other is Anastasia in my other section. So go ahead, Anastasia. How do they conceptualize forced migration?
They mentions like the refugees, like that's one way of conceptualizing it, right?
Yeah, and what's the other that they bring in?
Is it IDPs?
Exactly, which are internally displaced persons. And so one of the important conceptual points that Moore and Shellman make is that their theory relies on this kind of understanding of forced migration as being a more inclusive definition than many other scholars have used in the forced migration literature. It's more inclusive because it doesn't just include refugees who move across state boundaries, right? But it also includes people who are internally displaced as well. And why is that important for their theory? It's important for their theory because they say that their theory is about why people leave their homes, right? Their theory is predicated on this notion that people make a decision, sometimes forced upon them, but they make a decision to flee or to exit. But fleeing and exiting doesn't really matter what the destination is, right? That's the concern is not where one is going. It's the fact that they're going in the first place. You with me there? It's the notion of leaving regardless of destination that matters for Moore and Shellman. And so if they're going to really respect that theory that they're putting forward, right, that people either make a decision or they're kind of have a decision forced upon them based on their perception of threats to leave, regardless of where they go, then their definition of the concept forced migration has to include both people who cross borders, refugees, but also people who end up settling within their own country, but nonetheless left their home in the first place, right? And so notice here the connection between their theory, which has to do with people's perceptions of threat that translates into a decision to leave their home, and their conceptualization of forced migrant that focuses on the fact that they left regardless of where it is that they're going, right? If their entire theory, which we read about on pages 4 through 6, if their entire theory is about information that people have about the level of threat that they're vulnerable to, and how then they make the choice to leave their home, then their concept of forced migration has to include anybody leaving their home due to fear or threat perception, regardless of where they're going. And so this is something that we always want to be paying attention to. How do the authors or the researchers define their concepts? How does that translate into their theory? And how is it also then measured, right, within their study? Oftentimes there's some inconsistency there that we might call into question in a particular study. For example, if Moore and Shellman said, here's our theory, but we're only going to define forced migrants as refugees, and we're only going to measure, refugees, then we say, well, there's kind of an inconsistency between your theory and your concept and how you're measuring it, right? Okay, really good. So that's on the dependent variable side in terms of their concept. What about the measurement? Right? How do they actually measure forced migrants? This is what you find not under the concepts and the theory, but once you move to the research design on page 7. Right? That's where you get into the kind of brass tacks of, measurement and quantification and that kind of thing. So how is forced migration measured? I see the eyes kind of scanning the page, reading quickly. What did you come up with based on what they said? Go ahead, Connor.
So I'm not confident here.
Sure.
They talk about stock measures, but I don't know if that's just means stock in terms of like generic or like if that's an actual thing.
How do you understand what stock means?
Like if just reading it here, stock measure to me would mean like whatever the country uses to measure its refugees or IDPs, whatever.
To
Like,
measure what about them? How many they have?
yeah.
Okay, very good. So the stock of something is how much there is, right? So it's a rather static thing. They use that stock measure to come up with something else. What do they say that they use the stock measure for?
Oh, flow, because there isn't a flow measure available. It's like,
Exactly. And so one of the kind of empirical or quantitative shifts that they make from prior studies is instead of just taking the static measure of how many refugees and IDPs there are in a country at a given moment, right? Or in a given year. They want to understand how that changes over time. Think about it in terms of like your budget, right? You have a certain amount of money in your bank account right now, right? And so every single day you could take down in a data set, right? You could put it in Excel or put it in a notebook, the amount of money that you have every day. And that's going to give you some indication of your balance. But you might be less interested in the balance day to day as you are into the change in that balance day after day. So that would be the difference between your balance and your flow, right? Your cash flow, how much is coming in and how much is going out. And so what Moore and Shellman want is a flow measure. They're saying that they're more interested in how many refugees are entering and exiting, right? They want to know about the variability year after year after year within each country, more so than just the absolute value or the total number of refugees in a country, right? So it gives them a kind of a more dynamic numerical value. Now, what does that look like? Let me write for you just kind of the basic equation of what, because they talk about first differences, right? I think they use the term first differences, maybe not, but that's essentially what they're doing. And so I'll just show you what that is. And then fortunately last night, I already did something similar where I won't have to completely redraw from scratch. And I can just pop up the picture. But what we're talking about is, how do we get from a stock to a flow measure, right? So as we just said, stock is like your balance on any given day. So it's the number of refugees and IDPs in a country in a given year. So we have stock at the present year, year Y. And to get the flow measure, we're simply going to subtract the stock measure in the previous year, right? At year -1. And that equals the flow for a year, right? For a given year. They also say that if this flow measure, right, if flow, so it's kind of like if flow is negative, right, if you lost money, or if, you know, refugees and IDPs went down, then they make it a 0. In other words, they censor their data at the bottom end. So they're really mostly interested in kind of increases in forced migrants, right? When forced migrants are increasing, and what explains that. And so, you know, this is what they're doing. Now, let me show you a quick picture that I drew up last night to give you a sense of what this looks like, you know, in a data set. So here we have a data set with 3 countries, A, B, and C. And we're just going to focus on country A for now. In country A, we have data over time, 1990, 1991, 92, right, all the way through 97. This gives us, by the way, a time series cross-sectional data set. So hopefully you know that based on the previous video lecture, that we have a unit component of countries and a time component of years. So it's time series cross-sectional. Here's the stock measure, and I just made very simple numbers to make the arithmetic easy. But, you know, in 1990, there were 35 refugees and IDPs. In 91, there were 39. In 92, there were 47. In 93, there were 32. In 94, there were 32. And in 95, there were 55. So the flow measure simply takes the one and subtracts the prior one, right, which we saw just a second ago. Right? We take the stock measure of a given year and subtract the year before, and that gives us the change over time. And so we don't have a value for 1990 because you need 2 years to get a flow, right? And we don't know what happened in 1989 because it was before our data set. So that's just a null result, missing. But then in 1991, we do 39 minus 35 and we get 4. For 1992, we do 47 minus 39 and we get 8, right? For 93, there was a reduction of 15, so it's negative 15. 32 minus 47, right? Negative 15. Now, Moore and Shellman would convert that to a 0 because it's negative. And they said for negative values, we make it a 0. So now you know how we use first differences to create a variable that is a flow measure as opposed to a stock measure. We'll talk later in the semester about why we do that. I think I've explained a little bit as to, you know, kind of one of the reasons why, and it's because it gives a kind of greater dynamism in the variable itself. Generally, it reduces the overall values, right? Notice that you would go from the total number of refugees and IDPs to the change, and so we're talking about smaller values. It obviously then would give us a different mean and a different standard deviation. And you learned about descriptive statistics for today, right? So it's a different mean value and a different standard deviation. And generally speaking, well, let me leave that there. One of the other things that it does, but we'll come back to this later in the semester, kind of towards the end, actually. One of the other things that doing first differences does like this and getting a flow measure is it helps us to answer questions where we're more interested where we are more interested in the variation within a country over time than we are across countries. And of course, not just countries, but any unit, right? When we're generally more interested in variation within units over time than we are across units, then first differencing is a way to kind of put more of our analytical attention on that variation, right? The variation that's happening over time within a country, right? As opposed to across countries. But we'll talk more about that another time. All right, really quickly, and I'm going to kind of jump in for efficiency's sake pretty quickly here. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, right? Right. Okay. Is working through well, so we just talked about how the dependent variable is measured, and then you see on page 8 that that data comes from two places. The refugee data comes from UNHCR, and the IDP data is unpublished data that they got from the Global Refugee Migration Project. They put them together, got the stock, and then converted it into a flow using basic math, right? This year minus the year before. What about their independent variable government threat? So what we said about the theory a minute ago is that forced migration is kind of based on people's perceptions of threat that kind of put them in a situation of feeling like they have to leave their homes. And there are a variety of different kinds of threats that Moore and Shellman identify. Let's just talk only about government threat and then dissident threat, how those are measured, and then we'll move on. How is government threat measured? Alvina.
Yeah, I think they're using genocide and then political events and violations of human rights.
Why do you think they use two?
I think because like they say that like for genocide and politicide, like they use like previous data that was already provided by or like researched by this Harv's study.
Yeah, so that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask it a little bit differently. What's the utility of trying to measure government threat in two different ways, right? Because they're, as you just said, they're measuring it as genocide and politicide events. And then they're also measuring it separately as violations of human rights. Just practically speaking, why would they do both of those and not just one?
I guess like it will be more likely that like some kind of violation will occur. So like it doesn't always have to be genocide that will like cause like forced migration.
Good. Yeah, I think that hits it at the end there, right? It's the idea that these are two different types of government actions that capture very different kinds of things that represent threats to people's lives and safety and that kind of thing, security, right? And it captures it at two levels. One is genocide and politicide, big, huge, mass killing kinds of events that certainly would terrify people and make them consider leaving their homes. But if you only focus on that, which, as we just said, really matters, then you might be ignoring some lower level kinds of government action that nonetheless might be rather threatening and might make one feel like they should flee their homes, like more, unfortunately, routine forms of human rights violations. You know, physical integrity rights violations like torture or extrajudicial killing or corporal punishment or just other kinds of rights violations that if they become somewhat widespread or if the general kind of approach of the government is just more repressive, people may end up wanting to become refugees or IDPs. Not that they want to become that, but right, that they might want to flee their homes for security, even if the government doesn't do things that rise to the level of genocide and politicide, right? And so they're capturing two different kind of levels of government threat. Now, really quickly, how are they measured? Right? As you just mentioned, the first, genocide and politicide, is measured as an ordered scale measure. Ordered scale is ordinal, right? So we already covered nominal categorical, including dichotomous. Correct? I already went over the different types of variables in the lecture, right? So the context clues are still so key, even in the digital world, right? The kind of like nodding heads or the deer in headlights looks and that kind of thing. So just wanted to make sure. So this is an ordinal variable, which means that, right, it is in categories, but those categories have ranks. And so instead of a genocide and politicide event being a measure, it says here, of the number of deaths in each event, right? It's not like 14,327. That's not what's in the data, right? That's not what is actually in the data set spreadsheet that Moore and Shellman are using. Instead, right, that number is converted into a category. And the categories are stated down below in footnote 12, right? They say Barbara Harf uses a scale that goes up by like 0.5, but they, to simplify things, changed it, where 0 is no deaths, 1 is between 1 and 1,000, 2 is between 1,000 and 2,000, 3 is between 2,000 and 4,000, 4 is between 4,000 and 8,000, 5 is between 8,000 and 16,000. So you notice here that, you know, these are categories, but those categories are of different sizes, right? They become bigger as the category gets larger or more kind of expansive. And that allows us to still capture the variability of genocide and politicide and how significant it is, right? How big in magnitude it is, without the kind of false precision of saying there were, you know, 13,321 people who died in this politicide event, right? Because this is a rather messy, you know, kind of data. It's likely that there's going to be some error. And so we want to know that, generally speaking, that example of 13,271 deaths that I just mentioned would fall in category 5. And that's very different than categories 0 through 4 and 6 through 10, right? Those are all quite different from each other. And so we've kind of placed it as a value on a scale, but we didn't go with a scale that's kind of infused with a lot of probably error and imprecision or false precision by trying to identify exactly the number of people. Okay, so that's why they use an ordered scale, an ordinal variable. And then we also have the human rights violations as a measure of repression that they also do on a scale from 1 to 5. And this is just based on a coding scheme by coding reports from Amnesty International and the US Department of State about how much repression of different types there is in each country in every year. And so they have a kind of coding protocol that research assistants use in order to place a country in a given year on that 1 to 5 scale. Lastly, let's go to dissident threat. So instead of this being people fleeing their homes based on actions of the government that make them feel threatened, this is Moore and Shellman acknowledging that sometimes actions of non-state actors or, you know, domestic forces that are not the government make people feel like they need to leave their homes. So how do they measure that? What is the measure? Yeah, Christine?
It just seems like they're counting the amount of times these dissident events happen.
Exactly. And 2 dissident events in particular, right?
Yeah, guerrilla attacks and riots.
Okay. And so they don't detail this, but I'll tell you, just because I know this data. This is the cross-national time series data from Arthur Banks. And essentially, Banks uses New York Times International to code the number of times these different incidents occur in different countries in different years. So is there a news report of riot, right, in Sierra Leone or in Cambodia or in the United States or in Brazil in 2021? If so, then it's a 1. If there were 5 different reports of 5 different riots, right, then the number would be a 5. If there was a guerrilla attack, right, then it would be a 1. If there were 12 guerrilla attacks, then it would be a 12. There are a bunch of other ones in the bank's data set, like protests, demonstrations, marches, petitions, other kinds of things. But these are the 2 that they used for dissident threat. Now, we had a discussion before, and we're going to end on this for the Moore and Shellman thing, and then we're going to take a quick break and then come back and do Stata, okay? And we won't spend this much time every time going over the articles, but this was the first one and a really important one to kind of give us a sense of what we should be looking for in our readings, okay? So thanks for bearing with the time of it. We were talking before with Brammuller and Sartori, and just in general about validity, right, and reliability, and how we measure things, and the extent to which our concepts and our measures are in alignment, and that kind of thing. And as we read these empirical articles, we do want to have on our kind of critical scrutinizer hats. That doesn't mean we dismiss what we're reading, right, if we find some critique, but it means that we should be trying to be aware of any issues that arise that affect or limit the validity or reliability of the study or its results. So one of them here, instead of me asking it as a question, I'm just going to kind of tell you my thoughts just to kind of move things along. Here, one of the big issues, you heard me a second ago say that the bank's data set is based on the New York Times. So imagine how that, affects the validity or reliability of the data here on dissident threat, that certainly the New York Times doesn't have the same coverage of every country, right? Some countries are going to be covered a lot more than others. Sometimes it's because of the resources that the New York Times has committed on the ground in different countries. Sometimes it's the considered newsworthiness of a particular country or what's happening there according to their readership, right? I mean, it's a newspaper and it's the newspaper of record, quote unquote, so great. But at the same time, there is selection bias built in. And so if you look at this data, and there have been write-ups about the bank's data set that make this critique, but newspaper data is inherently going to be somewhat limited in its reliability because it's not going to have the exact same coverage of all of the same, of every country. Unfortunately, some countries are just considered more important than others or more newsworthy than others, and that is going to have an effect on the data. And so I could go on and on about newspaper data because I used that in my own research, but let's leave it there, that we want to be looking out for these kinds of potential issues. And those are some of the kinds of issues or pitfalls, errors of specification that Brammuller and Sartori were discussing. And we'll talk much more about errors of inference going forward. Okay, great. Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, I know that's not much, but I really want to get to important Stata things to send you into the weekend. So let's take a 5-minute break, come back at 7:13, and we will jump right into Stata. Please have Stata up and running when you come back with the state year data set open if you can. All right, see you in a few. Yeah, dang it. It's a bad habit. I forgot to hit record when we came back from the break. So hopefully you're following along okay. You also have this, actually, I just thought about this.
I never turned the recording off, so you're good.
Yeah, it's still on.
We recorded throughout.
Wait, what?
It's still recording.
It still says the meeting's recording for us.
I just turned it back on.
Oh.
But the good news is you already have a recording of starting with Stata tutorial number 2, where I'm doing exactly what I just did here, that you can open up and access on your own. like I said, I'm doing this, I'm spending the time to do this together here in person because I think that can be useful for these commands specifically, right? In case you have questions or issues. But you have the recordings anyway, so I'm not too worried. In the future though, when we're not doing things that I've pre-recorded anyway, I'll really try to remember to hit record again. So, okay, let's go ahead and come back to what we were doing. Share my screen. And I'm going to work kind of quickly through this now, right? But I just want to show you that when we browse, and by the way, you can cycle through all of these commands, all of this history over here. You can cycle through that with page up and page down on your keyboard. And it makes it easy. So if you have something that you don't want to retype and you just want to go back to it, you can just do page up, page down, okay? So let's browse that data. Now, really quickly, I love threes has all threes in it because we set it equal to 3. Regime has all missing because we set it equal to missing. Asia has ones where, right? It has ones where region is 4. Right? Everywhere that there isn't a 4, there's a missing variable or a missing value. Rural population, let's scroll down until we get some data. Rural population, right, is now a total number in thousands of people who live in rural areas based on rural population percentage and population in thousands. So you might say, well, what's 24% of 21,976? 5,308, right? Because we essentially created this variable based on that calculation. So the total population in Argentina in 1964 that lived in rural areas was 5,308,571. Okay, so we've created data out of thin air, and we've also created data based on other data that we already had. Cool, right? All right, so now let's just move into a couple of other things as we start to land the plane, as it were. One is to think about replacing values. So let's start with Asia, and then I'll give you a slightly more complex one. I'm going to do this a little out of order of the handout of the tutorial. Let's replace Asia, right, with zeros where the country is not Asia instead of missing. As we saw a second ago, right, we can look at a frequency table to see that Asia with the option miss will show us that right now Asia has ones and it has missings. But what we said at the very beginning is we want Asia to be zeros and ones and missings, right? If there's a missing value. But right now we don't have any zeros. So we want to replace the missings as zeros if the original region variable was a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 5, right? Because Asia was 4. And so we can go about doing that with the replace command, right? Replace Asia equals 0. Now you might think, well, why don't we just do this? Whoops, sorry. Right? Some of you might think, well, why don't we just replace the missings with the zeros so that way Asia is zeros and ones? And that makes some sense. The problem is if we do that, every single missing becomes a 0. But what about these, right? Remember when we looked at the region variable before? It had 1, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, but it also had 583 missings. And I would assert to you that we have no business turning missings into zeros, right? If we don't know why they were missings in the first place. because then we would be coding data on something that was actually just missing in the first place, right? And so I don't think we really have a good justification to turn these 583 missing values in the region variable into zeros in our new variable, which means it would be 1, 2, 3, or 5. And so the alternative is to do replace Asia equals 0 if region equals 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, right? That would be one option. A more convenient option would be to say replace Asia equals 0 if region does not equal 4, right? So replace it if it does not equal 4. And, whoops. I don't know what I was doing there. Sorry. And region does not equal missing. And what that's going to do, right, is it's going to make Asia a 0 if region equals 1, 2, 3, 5, or missing, but it's going to then exclude when region equals missing. Because we said, and region doesn't equal missing. So if region does equal missing, then it's going to ignore it, right? It's going to ignore those, right? So replace Asia equals 0. So make it a 0, right? Make all of these 0 if in our original variable it was a 1, 2, 3, 5, or missing, except ignore the missing. So 1, 2, 3, or 5. And I'll come back and talk to you about this a little bit more in the next example, okay? So if that's still confusing you a bit, just hold tight. Okay, so now it's made those changes for Asia, and if we tabulate Asia, we see 0s and 1s, but we also know that there are missings because the total is 8,015, but the total number of observations in our data is almost 8,600, right, which we see here. And so we can add again that missing option or miss option. And it'll also show us that we still have those original 583 missing values that were missing in the region variable before, right? Missing here. And that's because we want to preserve the integrity of our missing data from the original variable region. Does that make sense? Right? We want to preserve the integrity of our missing data that we had in our original region variable that we used to make Asia. We have no business calling these zeros in our new variable Asia. We only have business calling these zeros in our new variable Asia, 1, 2, 3, and 5, but not the missings. Okay, so let's do one more. I now want to take our regime variable, right? We can tabulate regime and it'll say no observations because remember, regime is just missing right now. And I want to make that dichotomous, 0s and 1s, okay? Based on the following rule. I want to make it a 0 if the polity score is between -10 and 5, right? Polity scores go from -10 to +10, and it's a measure of democracy. It's a measure of democratic institutions. So it's not really about like civil rights and these kinds of aspects of democracy. It's about institutional democracy, checks and balances and stuff like that. So we want to make our new variable regime a 0 if the polity score is between -10 and 5, right? -10 is like North Korea, Positive 10 is like Sweden. Okay, and so it's a scale. And then we want to make our new variable regime a 1 if it's a 6 through a 10. Okay? So what we would do is replace our new variable regime. We're gonna set it equal to 0 if what? Go ahead, Shannon.
Wouldn't it be if polity equals, and then do you have to type out all those numbers, or is there a way to do a range?
Yeah, how might we do a range? Jasmine, were you going to jump in?
Yeah.
So that's a good thought, Shannon. So you could type them all out as like if polity equals -10 or -9 or -8, but that's tedious. So Jasmine, how would you propose doing a range?
Sorry, I might have spoke too soon, but I remember you said it was in between -10 and 5, right, for 0?
Yeah.
So it would be if less than 5.
Close, but we want to include 5.
Oh, if less than or equal to 5.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. So then it's going to capture the 5 and everything below it. Okay. And those will become zeros. It made 5,315 changes. If you add up all these numbers here, it would be 5,315. Now we want to replace regime with a 1 if what? Jump in, anybody, because I have a hard time seeing the hands. Time is dwindling. Please hurry.
If polity is less than or equal to 8, no. Yeah.
Let's say we want to capture these. So go ahead, Chanel. If we want to capture the 6 through 10, what might we use? Is there something more intuitive than a less than in this situation?
Greater than or equal to 6.
Okay, so we could do a greater than or equal to 6. And that would capture 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now here, before you hit enter, is the one really important thing I want you to like circle and star in your notes, because it always trips up some folks, and it makes sense to trip you up because it's a ridiculous thing that is just part of the way Stata is built, so they can't really change it. These dots, right? These dots here, missing values, those periods, Stata stores as infinitely large numbers. And I know that's really bizarre, but it looks like a dot, right? It looks like just a missing, but Stata kind of has it saved in its mind as some infinitely huge value. And what that means is that is also greater than or equal to 6. So if we do that code, it would convert the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and missing into a 1. But we don't want those missings to become 1s, right? We want the missings to stay as missings. We want what's missing in polity to be missing in regime as well. We have no business changing it to a 1. And so this is where we also have to either cap the top or exclude the missing. So we could do and polity is less than or equal to 10, and that gives us a range, right? Greater than or equal to 6, less than or equal to 10, that gives us these. Whoops, these. But the other thing we can do is, just like before with Asia, is do and polity does not equal missing, right? Make regime a 1 if polity is greater than equal to 6, but not missing. Right, and you know this is does not equal. And so if you hit enter there, then it's made 3,180 changes. We can check our work with the tabulate command by doing the old variable polity and the new variable regime that's based on polity, and hit enter. And now we have what's called a contingency table, or a cross tabulation, where we have in the rows, right, in the rows across, whoa. In the rows across, we have different values of polity. In the columns, we have different values of our new regime variable. And so what we should see, and thankfully what we do see, is that if polity is between -10 and +5, regime is a 0, right? All the observations for regime 0 are between -10 and 5. All the observations for regime equals 1 are 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And we can check that even further with our missings if we add that miss option. And we see that all the missings in regime are also the missings in polity, right? It's the 103 that we had from before. So that's a good way just to check your work to make sure that regime zeros are the values you wanted them to come from in polity, and regime 1 is the values you wanted them to come from in polity, and that your missings are maintained. Okay. So I, have essentially promised myself since yesterday that I'm going to be much stricter with myself about ending, on time. I can't promise we won't do 8:01 or 8:02 on occasion. I don't think, we're that pressed for every minute that we can't afford ourselves 1 or 2 minutes of a buffer here and there. With that said, though, I'm going to really make sure that we end more or less on time. So with that said, I'm not going to enter into the part about recode because you have a recording of me doing that. You have a handout that walks you through doing that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about it next week when we meet again, or in the discussion forum, of course. And so those are places where we can continue to engage about what's remaining in starting with Stata number 2. Okay. With that said, are there any? I'm just trying to think for myself. Are there any final things that I want to say or impart or do before we go? Yes. You have, just as a reminder, you have the practice problems 1 available for you. And I think I mentioned this before, but I just want to say again that with practice problems 1, there are 2 options in there. One of them is using the state year data set that we've just been practicing with. The other one is using the UN fatalities data from Marina Hankey that you read about before. And so if you want to get out of the mold of just doing the state year data set, of the same variables, and you want to try something with data that you read about on UN fatalities, feel free to do that, right? And so you just click practice problems 1 and you have 2 different folders, one with the state year, one with UN fatalities. If you hop in here, you have the data set, you have the do file of me doing every single question, and then you have the PDF of me giving you the questions, right? And essentially, they're not even questions, they're straight up just instructions to follow. And that'll just give you a little bit more practice doing the kinds of things that we've been doing in the starting with Stata tutorial. Okay, so that'll give you a bit more practice there. Feel free to do that together, right? That's absolutely fine. And to use my do file to help you through that. But of course, if you have questions or hangups or whatever, go to the forum and we can, hash things out there. All right. On your end, are there any remaining questions, comments? Leo?
So for the practice assignment, that we practice but we don't submit it, correct?
Correct. And I would say it's good to practice if you feel you need it. You don't have to if you don't want to, right? So it's completely up to you. Makita?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the skills assessment is due tonight.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
So please do submit that. I haven't looked at the ones that were submitted for the section yesterday. But ultimately, yeah, have that submitted this evening. And I will review them and I will let you know if you need to redo it. Otherwise, you won't hear from me about it. Okay. I didn't make that clear before, but if you don't hear back from me on your skills assessment, then you're good. Okay. Pass. Otherwise, I'll let you know that you have some questions to redo and which ones they are, and you can redo them until you pass, and then you'll be fine. Okay. But you have a bit of buffer room there where I think you can miss 2 and still pass, right? So I'll let you know which ones you missed if you need to retake, let's say, and you can simply redo the number of those necessary to get you to that passing point. That is really, that assignment is really about making sure people did their due diligence at the beginning of the semester to put your minds in the right mode, number one, and to refresh yourselves on the basic mathematical things that I don't want to have to be laboring over as we're committed to so many other things, right? So that's my concern on that front. So thank you for the clarification there. I will, one last thing, right? I think I said this before, but I will make available to you the official problem set one later tonight. It'll pop up on the class website, and I'll probably send out an email then notifying you that it's available. Okay, and you can begin that whenever you like. It's due next Friday. Okay, final questions, comments, snide remarks? Great. See you. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor
Bye.
Spath, do you want